Hey, let's talk about humor. I am going to explain what makes things funny. And so when you go to write your jokes and analyze your jokes, you're going to have a much better idea of why those things are funny. And if they're not funny yet, what you can do to improve them and make them funny. This is kind of a mechanical approach. And there are a lot of different approaches to comedy, and you can absolutely do whatever works well for you. I think it's a good idea to learn the mechanical approach because then you can grow your intuition so much faster if you know what's working about a thing and what's not working about it. So we'll get into it. I do want to let you know, though, that the rules that I give you for what makes something funny, the guidelines, elements of humor, these are not how you write a joke. I don't want you to brainstorm and think that every idea that you have is not good unless it already abides by each of these rules for humor. That's not how this works. That'll make it really a trying task to make anything funny. It'll make everything so much harder. What you should do is brainstorm freely. Just go for quantity. Explore. Let your ideas lead to more ideas. The idea itself might not be something you can use, but it unlocks a whole new chamber of ideas, and you just have ideas that nobody's ever had before. And eventually you're going to land on something that qualifies under one of the rules of humor that I'm about to give you. And then you'll work on adding more of those in so that it can fill out the entire mechanism of the joke to make something funny. Okay, so here are the rules of humor. No more drum roll. Here's the rules of humor. So 1, surprise. 2, status lowering. 3, making sense. And those 3 might not make a ton of sense just at the outset, just me telling you, but I'll explain each of them. Okay, first, let's talk about surprise. Now, with surprise in humor, I'm not talking about the kind of surprise that you would get if you're watching a scary movie and something jumps out at you. I'm not talking about the kind of surprise that happens at a surprise party when somebody walks in and everyone shouts surprise. I am talking about the kind of surprise where the audience has an assumption or an expectation that they don't know that they have at all. And then that assumption or expectation is revealed to be incorrect and something else is correct. Okay? This is not the kind of assumption that would happen if somebody says, I assume that something is the case. Because if somebody says, I assume that something is the case, they're leaving open the possibility that something else is the case. And so that's not very surprising if something else is the case. It has to be an assumption that the audience did not realize they had. Okay? Kind of an epiphany style of a surprise. That's the kind of surprise we're talking about. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2, status lowering. In every joke, something has its status lowered. Something is made to be or seem sillier, dumber, or otherwise worse than it was before, right? Something is made fun of. And this is not to say that every joke is, or every piece of humor is mean. That is not the case at all. In fact, if something does come across as mean, then that's not funny. What you're looking for with status lowering is an optimal amount of status lowering, right? Not too much, not too little. It's what the audience would be most satisfied by, right? What would be really satisfying for this audience to have something made to seem silly, right? What makes it seem silly or dumb or whatever in a way that really makes the audience happy, right? That's the status lowering that you're looking for. And that's different for different audiences and for different topics. That's part of the subjectivity of comedy, right? So if you are going to make fun of a famous figure, the way that you'd make fun of a dictator is different than the way that you would make fun of a saint or somebody who is just beloved by everybody, right? You can make fun of somebody who we all regard as really, really bad to a greater degree. You can be meaner, you can be harsher about the status lowering. Whereas with the beloved figure, you probably want to pick something that's like just a little tease, or that like lowers a status that people don't really care about that person. Maybe give like a compliment at the same time. The status lowering range is going to be a bit narrower for the figure that people really like. Okay, so that's status lowering. There's a surprise and there's a status lowering. And then finally, making sense. With the making sense in comedy, you need to have a flow of understanding, just a very smooth flow of understanding. The whole audience needs to understand what you're talking about so that when you get to that punchline, everybody gets it. They all can have that aha moment. The surprise can just hit them, right? So you don't want any begged questions or references that the audience doesn't understand. You don't want any thing sticking in their craw, going like, okay, yeah, I get it, but also like, why, why would the comedian say this? Or like, that doesn't, you don't want anything like that. You don't want anything crossing their mind except for the information, the assumptions that you want them to make, and the surprise that you want them to have. Okay? So, making sense. Just a smooth flow of understanding that leads to that punchline. And then the punchline they get. Right? The way that this exists in jokes, you might have already guessed, right? So you have the setup, and in the setup, the audience understands what you're talking about. So that helps with making sense. And it causes the audience to have an assumption. And then in the punchline of that joke, there's the surprise. That assumption that they made is incorrect. Something else is true. And that something lowers the status of something. So something is made to seem sillier or, whatever. And if there's no begged questions, no references the audience doesn't get, nothing else that's getting in the way of them just understanding it, you've got a joke. Cool. Now, it might seem pretty simple. Well, I don't know if it seems simple. If it doesn't seem simple, it will become a lot more clear because we'll go over some examples. Okay, here's a bit of homework for you. This was super helpful for me to help me understand why jokes are funny and what makes them funny. And this was a piece of advice that I think I heard from Anthony Jeselnik. So take the text of a joke that you really like. This can be a joke that you read somewhere. And if it's a joke that was funny because you watched it, then maybe watch the video multiple times rather than reading it. I like to get a joke that was in text because then I could just go to a coffee shop and just sort of like think about it for a while quietly. I like to do that. But what you can do is take whatever joke it is that you really, really like and rewrite it as many ways as you can. And as you're doing each of those rewrites, I want you to think about everything that changes about it in terms of meaning and in terms of the impacts on humor. So is the surprise being moved a little bit before it was before or after, like later in the sentence, right? Is some of that surprise being given away early so that the audience can guess what the surprise is? Because that would make it less surprising, probably not as good of a joke. Is the status lowering more satisfying, less satisfying, more clear, less clear? Is the entire text of the joke more clear? Is it more concise? Is it less concise? So when you are doing all of these rewrites, be thinking about those things. What is changing about it? How is the audience understanding it differently? Even just subtly, even just 1% differently. Notice all those changes. And as you do, you will get so much more comfortable with humor. And you'll understand the mechanisms that are making that joke work or not work so much better. And you'll be able to discern what the tools are that made it that way. Once you identify what's working about a joke and not working, it's so much easier to improve it because you know which pieces to move out and what to replace them with. Super helpful. All right, now that we have a pretty good idea of what the elements of humor are, I want to go over some joke structures with you. Because joke structures are really helpful at getting you to the next step. You might be thinking, okay, I know what makes a joke funny. I can analyze a joke, but how do I write a joke? Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Do that brainstorming, that really expansive exploration, and just write down a bunch of ideas. And then once you do that, pick out the ideas that you like and filter those ideas through these different structures. Because the reason that you like certain ideas is probably because it's got something going for it, right? That might be it's got a really good surprise, or it's got a really interesting or satisfying status lowering already, or maybe it's just a fascinating observation that nobody's had before. It's clever, which is, helpful for the surprise. Now, what these joke structures that I'm going to explain do is that they're great at adding certain elements that the humor might be missing. So if your idea already has surprise, some of these joke structures are great at adding status lowering. If your joke idea already has status lowering, some of these joke structures are really great at adding surprise. Some of these joke structures, great at adding both. And once you have done that, filtered your ideas through these joke structures, they'll come out on the other side with a so much more filled out draft that has more of the elements of humor in place. And then once you get the making sense working really well, and you have those other two elements too, you've got a joke. A couple of things to know about these joke structures. One is that it is not a limit of one joke structure per joke. In fact, if you can get multiple joke structures working at the same time, then it can add some nice extra layers of humor in your joke that can make it even more funny because there's more to laugh at. As long as it doesn't interrupt the making sense portion. If they confuse each other, then that can be an issue. So layers are great. A mess isn't, which I guess goes without saying. So making sense, always important. But if you can get layers of joke structures going, excellent. The other thing to note is that these joke structures that I'm going to give you, they're not the entirety of all joke structures, right? These are some that are helpful to get you started. You might notice more joke structures by analyzing other comedians, and you might make up your own just by brainstorming, thinking about it for a while. These are ways of thinking about humor, and there are a lot of other ways of thinking about humor that you can come up with. Okay, let's start with the first one. Expand the picture. An expand the picture style joke is one that relies on the visual that the audience creates in their brain. So if I said I was playing soccer, you might think a soccer ball, a field, goals, other players, uniforms. There are a lot of things that you picture when I say that I was playing soccer. Those are assumptions that you're making. I didn't say any of those things were happening. And so those are opportunities for me to create a surprise. So this joke structure is great for adding surprise. You expand the picture. You make the picture bigger than it was before. So outside of people's assumptions and expectations about that picture based on the small amount of information that I gave earlier. That's an expand the picture style joke. Next is a social or emotional reframing. In this joke structure, you are giving information that doesn't match your social frame that you're using to convey that information, or your emotional frame to convey that information. And so the mismatch between those two things can create surprise because the audience wasn't expecting that social frame or that emotional frame with that info. And it can also add some status lowering. Often the status lowering is on the teller because if the social frame doesn't match the information, then that often looks silly. It's silly for the person to quote unquote get that wrong, right? And so that can be some status lowering along with the surprise in that joke structure. But it's not always self-deprecating. Sarcasm is a good example of using a social reframing in a way that puts the status lowering on the thing that's being talked about, right? Sarcasm is a social reframe where something else is having its status lowered rather than the teller. Next is the rule of three. Rule of three is great for adding surprise because when you have a minimum of two things, that creates a pattern. And once a pattern has been discerned by the audience has assumptions about what the third thing in the pattern is. But that's an assumption. That's an expectation. That's an opportunity for you to surprise the audience. And so if you give two items that create a pattern, you can deviate from that pattern in the third item to create surprise. The next joke structure is a pre-existing setup or assumption. When we tell setups to jokes, there are two main reasons to tell those setups. One, so that the audience knows what we're talking about. And two, so that the audience can make assumptions so that we can reveal that those assumptions are incorrect in the punchline to create that surprise. But the audience is making assumptions all the time. When the comedian goes on stage, the audience has assumptions that the comedian will go on stage. The audience assumes that the comedian will talk to them, that the comedian will face them, that the comedian will talk to the mic, that the comedian talk into the mic, that the comedian will, if they talk to the mic, that could be surprising too. That the comedian will be wearing a certain range of clothing. There are so many assumptions that the audience is making, and those are all opportunities to create surprise by doing something else. So sometimes you don't need to tell a setup. Sometimes if you can recognize that the audience is making assumptions, you can just skip all the way to the punchline, kind of a true one-liner. The next joke structure is an analogy or a metaphor. So with this one, it's you have an observation, you have some object or concept, and then think about what is similar to that. What is that thing like? And then compare those two things through an analogy or a metaphor. This thing is like this thing, or this thing is this thing, right? That's kind of the difference between an analogy or a metaphor. It's just that syntax of is like. Anyway, the comparison between those two things can be surprising if the audience never thought about the connection between those two things. And it can lower status because the thing that you compare it to, if it's a lower status than the other thing, it pulls that other thing down, right? And so you can lower the status of something by comparing it through analogy or a metaphor to something of a lower status than it. And specifically in the ways that you lower its status, that can really or the ways that you connect those two, the associations specifically that you make, you can lower that status quite a bit. All right, and the final joke structure is an intentional mistake. In this joke structure, you take a thing that the audience would take for granted as true and just get it wrong, right? You are looking with this joke structure for a window, right? You want something that is silly enough that it's absurd, that the audience doesn't just accept it as a mistake that you are genuinely making, right? So you want it silly enough so that they don't think that, but you also don't want it so silly that they don't believe that that could possibly happen, right? So there's the window. You want something that they could think a very dumb person might think that. And if you hit that window, then that can be a great way to be surprising because they didn't think you would make that mistake, but also be status lowering because you are basically making a joke about being dumb, right? In a way that they don't actually think that you're dumb, but it's fun to pretend. They like that kind of a thing. It's a nice self-deprecating bit of humor in that structure.